Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, and welcome to today's webinar, Challenges in Employment-Sponsored Green Card Cases, presented by Envoy. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about Envoy. The global immigration process is frustrating, confusing, and stressful. And for the past 20 years, Envoy has been on a mission to fix that. Since then, we've secured work authorization in over 190 countries around the globe, and Envoy affiliated attorney case approval rates are over 98% for over 30 cases. And our top 5 markets include STEM, consulting, manufacturing, advertising, and education. All right, now I would like to introduce our presenters, starting first with Allison Krantz. She is a licensed attorney. Prior to joining Envoy, she represented Fortune 500 companies in business immigration matters and acquired critical experience.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Allison. Pleasure to have you on today. Next is Greg Legal, a senior product manager at Envoy Global. Greg, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for joining too. Prior to joining Envoy, Greg co-founded a predictive analytics startup and held senior product roles at Yahoo. He also received his PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. His research focused on organizational change, technology, strategy, and labor markets. All right. I'm going to turn it over to Allison, who's going to go over our agenda and then kick off the presentation.
Okay, well, we have a lot to talk about today, and I just want to remind everyone that this is going to be a level 2 webinar today. We're going to assume that you're familiar with some of the basic immigration terms and the basic immigration concepts. If you're not, you're still welcome to join, but you can refresh your memory and gain some more understanding by visiting Envoy's Resource Center on our website, which is envoyglobal.com. And there's some resources there that can provide you with some Immigration 101 basics and a better understanding of some of the terminology that you might hear today. We're going to be assuming that you have a basic understanding of some of the basic non-immigrant work visa categories, difference in terms of the different green card categories, EB1, EB2, EB3, have a basic understanding of the perm processing, how that works. We're going to refresh your memory on all this, so if you don't know them well, don't worry, you'll still be able to follow along, but we're not going to be necessarily explaining what those terms mean. So I just wanted to make everyone aware of that before we continue on. Today on our agenda, we're going to be talking briefly about the overall global talent landscape and what we're seeing here. We're going to talk about streamlining program management and setting expectations for employees, that as well as sponsored for nationals as well as managers. We're going to be looking and reviewing the green card process, talking about planning and anticipating pathways within the immigration journey. And then we're going to talk about some of the common challenges and how technology can be used to address those common challenges and how to make it more efficient, a little bit more streamlined. As we're going through the webinar today, feel free to ask questions throughout. As we get your questions, if it's on topic on point, we'll ask them. If we're going to address them later in the presentation, make sure you listen out for that, because maybe that's why we're not addressing that specific question. Also, if we don't get to your question today, we'll reach out and do our best to answer that. If you have a question that's specific to your circumstances, your employees, your particular case, that would probably be better addressed by your attorney, but we might reach out and provide some insight on that to you. Okay? All right. So here we go. All right. Greg, let's talk about the global talent landscape.
Thanks very much, Allison. So I just want to sort of kick this off by, sharing a little anecdote, a little story. I was out walking my dog the other day and actually ran into a guy that I used to work with at a different company, who's CTO for another company here in Chicago. And he asked me if I had any software developers that I thought might be looking for a new job. And I just kind of laughed at him and shook my head and said, "You got to be crazy. I don't know what you're thinking about." And the story that he told me was that they've been trying to hire for a particular role for quite a long time right now. And the market here in Chicago, as it is and pretty much any place you're going to run into across the U.S. is such that they made an offer to a candidate. They interviewed him that morning. Everyone liked him. They made an offer to him that afternoon, and the guy's response was, "I've already taken another job." All right, so I think, not just here in the United States, but really globally, one of the things that we're really seeing, and I'm sure this comes as no surprise to any of you who are on this call, is that there's a huge surge in both the number of jobs, STEM-related jobs that are going to be available over the next few years. At the same time, there's a massive shortage in people that are able to fill those jobs. And it's not just that you want to look at sort of the local marketplace. We don't want to just look here at Chicago and take any old developer or any old person that's going to be able to fill a particular position. I think everyone's on the same page in the sense that we want to find those people who are really excellent, who are really going to not only just be able to, do sort of the minimum requirements of the job, but really help our companies, move to the next level. And I'm always sort of reminded when I think about this is there's a great series of stories about Jeff Bezos and what he asks for in terms of hiring. It's really not just finding somebody to fill the position, but really finding someone who can fill that position and really accelerate the company and all those people around him, right? So very often how that shakes out is it's not somebody necessarily here locally. It's not just about finding somebody here in, say, the Chicago market or the San Francisco market who can help do that or who can actually do that job. It's really about finding the best person to do that job. And very often that person is a foreign national, right? And so, you have sort of this tension between we have all these jobs that are going unfilled. We have this massive shortage of developers and other technical talent in particular to fill those jobs. And so what are companies doing? Increasingly, companies are starting to look more and more towards overseas labor markets to be able to find the right type of people to fill the kind of jobs that are out there right now. So we know from some of the work and the research that we've done is that 53% of employers are really expecting their company's foreign national headcount to increase in the next year, right? And at the same time, even U.S. companies are also expecting their overseas headcount to increase, right? And so both of those processes really require or really demand sort of consultation and working with your immigration legal services provider to help facilitate that process and move it forward. And at the same time, one of the other things that we've recently found is that 70% of employers argue that sourcing foreign national employees is really, really important to their company's talent acquisition strategy, right? It's critical for us here at Envoy. It was critical back in the day when I was at Yahoo. Everybody really wants to find the best talent regardless of where they're located around the world. The problem, of course, is that if they are located elsewhere, it becomes even more of a challenge, to not only to hire that person, to find that right person, but also then to be able to bring them into the U.S. if they're not already present in the U.S. or if they are present in the U.S., transfer them into your new company. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Allison for a second and let her talk a little bit more detail about really what the role of competent immigration counsel is in helping you not only bring in that one or two particular individual, but really structuring a policy and immigration program and how that can help you really both strategically in terms of talent acquisition, but also sort of just more broadly in HR.
Yeah. So, one of the things that is really important is that we're talking about a lot of different challenges as we go throughout this presentation. We're going to provide you with some solutions and towards then really talk about how technology can help streamline those solutions. But as we're going through and as you're thinking about your company and what your program looks like and what you're offering, you really want to make sure that if you're making any changes, you run it by your immigration counsel and perhaps even your general counsel also. Most companies should have more than one attorney involved in deciding how to create their immigration programs and policies, and that's because oftentimes when you make a change in your policy, or who you're sponsoring, when, how all those things happen, it impacts not just immigration law, but it can go into areas of employment law, contract law, labor law, tax law. So you want to make sure those things are reviewed, because while you're being compliant with immigration law, you don't want to unintentionally violate another area of law, or kind of get a little bit too close for comfort for that particular line. So you want to keep that in mind. Going to the next area, we're going to start talking about streamlining your program and setting expectations through creating a policy for your immigration program. I want to remind you that there's more information in this presentation than we're able to cover today. And we did this because we want you to be able to use this webinar as a resource for the future. It's going to be available for everyone online through our resource center. So there's going to be a number of pieces of information across the webinar that we're not going to address specifically, but we hope that you'll be able to find them helpful. One of the things that I want you to consider is working smarter, not harder, and an immigration policy can help you do that. Okay, so immigration policies are great for employees. Okay, they can set the expectations of the employee being sponsored themselves as well as their managers. They can offer transparency and peace of mind. A transparent policy will reduce anxiety often felt by foreign nationals. It communicates the company's expectations, and it can help get that talent that Greg was talking about that's so hard to seek. It lets the foreign nationals, the sponsored employee, prior to undertaking investment in your company and turning their work and labor over to your organization, it lets them know what they can expect. And it also sets timetables that all parties involved can be held accountable to. Another aspect of it is that it can explain the company's immigration-related perks. We're seeing more and more as talent is needed and necessary. Companies are becoming more competitive with the different perks that they offer. And this really has to do with deciding whether your program is going to be employee-driven versus employer-driven. What are we doing considering the employees' expressed desires and goals and decision-making when it comes to immigration? Are we providing them any special benefits or incentives? For example, some organizations believe that employee satisfaction results in greater loyalty. So what kind of perks are we talking about? Maybe travel, greater time off so people can go abroad more easily and visit family, in-company program assimilation programs, flexibility for allowing a spouse to be hired if the spouse has work authorization as a dependent, finding places for those individuals that are important to that primary employee's family. Also, here we go, offers the ability to refer employees and managers to resource when questions arise, sets reliable standards and commitments. Let's talk about that a little bit more while looking at the next slide. Something that is probably number one question you're going to get about your policy, or if you're interviewing someone new and considering sponsoring them, and the topic of green card comes up, is when do you sponsor a green card? What is the time frame? And there's different options to consider. Some companies have no specific time frame, right? They may do it, they may not do it. We'll see. We'll decide later on when we cross that bridge. What we're seeing in the research that we're doing and the surveys that we're conducting on an annual basis is that larger companies tend to offer immediate green card sponsorship as a signing bonus for joining the company, which is a big perk. Some other companies, depending on their size and also depending on how motivated they are to get that foreign talent, have flexibility in their policies. Some after 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, some wait longer. Often there are multiple decision makers involved in the immigration process, from hiring managers, lower and higher level managers, human resources, and then of course the sponsored employees themselves. And some of these parties, immigration is not always their number one priority. And so it can be really helpful to have a policy on how this green card process is working and what that timetable looks like. because then it ensures that all parties are following through with the company's commitments. And again, it's just an added piece of security for that employee. Also, as important projects or emergency arises, the timetables can define what is reasonable and what is unreasonable. So, for example, some companies, rather than saying we'll start after 6 months or after 1 year, they'll choose a time frame, right? We'll start between year 2 and year 3, just so there's a little bit more flexibility in the policy to accommodate those important projects. Other will say, even more vague, no specific date, or no later than X, right? We're going to start no later than year 3. To give the managers even more flexibility, because doing a green card, it takes time. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit more, all the different steps and the complications there. Something we wanted to share with you is that employers are making changes to their green card policies. We've seen an increase in green card policy and policy changes for a number of reasons. In my opinion, the top 2 being increased anxiety around regulations, speculations. There's been a number of changes advanced through the White House in terms of the administration's priorities and affecting USCIS processing of certain type of applications. That makes employees nervous. That makes employees concerned about their future. Also, employee satisfaction and retention. If we're bringing in highly skilled people who hold strong value to our company, it makes sense to invest in the talent that you want to keep. We found that 70% of employers are sponsoring green cards, and nearly 98% have changed their green card policy over the past 12 months. So it's certainly something to think about and something that's very important. Some other benefits in creating a policy and some things you want to think about. And if you don't have one already or you're reviewing the policy that you currently have, let's talk about a couple of best practices. While it's very important to define the company policy and to set appropriate benchmarks, it's also important to recognize that a good policy allows for flexibility and exceptions, because as soon as you put something in writing, you're going to have to make a lot of exceptions, right? It's just the rule of life and always the rule in law. Immigration sponsorship rarely runs perfectly. There's lots of factors that influence decision-making, from budget to operational changes to corporate reorganizations and layoffs. So you want to make sure that now is the right time to make this change. Maybe it's not right now. Maybe it's going to be in the future. Maybe it's going to be next year. But overall, creating a policy is going to address some of the headaches that you might have and some of the conversations you have to have on a regular basis with decision makers and helping them come to the decision necessary to whether they're going to go forward with a certain foreign national talent or not. Also, we have the last item here on the list, highlighted in purple, the changing political landscape. Okay, this is, I think, more relevant now than ever. No one likes change and uncertainty, especially when we're dealing with people's lives, employment, livelihoods, families. We all want predictability. And there's been a number of changes recently. Most recently, 2 USCIS policy memos were released, and they have the potential to change how immigration process happens in some aspects. However, it's very important to remember that the law is the law, and only act of Congress can change that. Most of the immigration categories, the actual visa categories, were created through law. But how those visa applications are processed and how green cards are processed are generally created through regulations, which is under the executive branch, which means that's controlled by the president ultimately. So, sure, there can be more hoops to jump through, more steps to take, greater scrutiny, but the law is the law, and if somebody actually meets the qualifications for a certain category, that still should go through. Just want to touch on some of the memos that came out most recently in June and July, because we're going to kind of be talking about those throughout, discussing some of the challenges, because they're kind of a basis for why it's more important than ever to make sure that everything is organized with our immigration program. The first memo I want to reference is in regards to RFE's request for evidences, and that was issued on July 13th of this past year, or of this current year. And this memo gives officers wider discretions to issue a denial on a case without first issuing a request for evidence or a NOID, a notice of intent to deny. This means essentially that previously it was considered an officers were encouraged to issue an RFE or a NOID prior to denying a case. This was so the applicant or the employer would have a chance to respond to any weaknesses or uncertainties or inconsistencies that officer might identify. Part of the reason that was done is to make case processing more efficient, right? It takes time to overcome a denial. It takes time to deny a case. There could also be just a misunderstanding, or there could be human error. And rather than denying that case and it going through an appeal or motion to reopen process, or having to file a new application, some of that, it was decided, let's just give people a chance to respond before denying that case. And this new memo says that that's not necessary. Officers do have that discretion, which they always did and they always could, and they could automatically deny a case if they felt that was necessary. But, this memo lets them know that they have the power to do that and encourages that if they think that is necessary in a certain circumstance. It doesn't mean that RFEs are going away or NOIDs are going away. They still have the ability to issue that. It just gives them more authority to take that step. Another memo that was issued on June 28th gives officers greater discretion to issue notices to appear. Now, the notices to appear, also known as NTAs, are the charging document that places someone in deportation or removal proceedings in front of a deportation court. USCIS officers always had the ability to do this for some extent, for some cases, but generally it would be up to the officer's discretion whether they're going to refer a particular person or case to ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, let them do an investigation, and decide whether that person should go into deportation proceedings. The memo lets officers know that they do have the authority and is within their discretion to issue those NTAs, notices to appear, immediately placing someone into deportation proceedings. This is a significant policy change, and it also affects other agencies. Not just one agency is responsible for that deportation process, and USCIS policies directly affect and impact these other agencies, and the other agencies haven't had a chance to respond, and they've communicated that they need to. So when we have more information about what this looks like and what this means for people, we will definitely provide it. But right now, the other agencies haven't had a chance to respond yet, so it's hard to tell you exactly what this means other than what we've shared right there. So as more information comes out, watch for updates. We'll definitely be providing that, and most likely when we have all the information, we'll have a specific webinar just on that topic. Okay, but let's give you a quick green card review just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Immigration is not one size fits all, okay? You need to include an immigration attorney in your planning. There's lots of different pathways, not just one. We have all these just starting visas here. That's what the orange represents. Sometimes people transition to different visas. Sometimes they're going straight to green cards. Immigration is really complicated, and just because what generally works for engineer one at your company seems to work across the board, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best choice or the most cost-efficient choice. So we really encourage you to have a professional when making your plans. Quick green card review. There's always at least 3 steps, sometimes more, in terms of the green card process. We always have some type of triggering event, and that triggering event qualifies a person for the green card. So, for example, a triggering event for national could be getting the job and the employer going through and completing a perm process, if we're talking about perm process green card. Step 2 would be the employer's filing an I-140 form, the petition for alien worker application, right? That's the employer letting the government know we intend to sponsor this individual for a green card. And step 3 would be the employee actually confirming to USCIS, yes, I actually want to be a permanent resident. Yes, I intend to live here in the United States permanently, and they'd file their application. This can also look like other steps in different categories. If we go to the next slide, right? So we always have some type of qualifying event, some type of triggering event. It could be under an EB1, the individual meets the EB1 category, right? They're an individual with exceptional ability, or they're an executive or manager at a multinational company. Again, and then we have the employer's petition, the Form I-140, and then we have the adjustment of status owned by the employee, or if they're abroad, consular processing. But what we find with our business is most of the time that individual is already an employee and already inside the United States. So it's usually the adjustment of status process, the I-45 form filed by that employee. But there's always some type of trigger event. Now, sometimes the triggering event has more than one step, and we're going to talk about that because that's what PERM looks like, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But before we get into that, I just want to remind people that one of the complications with the immigration process and immigration programs is that sometimes it's the skill level of the job that determines the EB category, while other times it's the credentials of the individual that determines the EB category. And often that's a shock to employees, and often that is something that they're not aware of and can be a little bit confusing. Okay, so for example, they assume because they have a PhD or they have a master's degree, they should be in the EB2 or the EB1 category. And unfortunately, it's not that simple. We actually, if we're dealing with PERM in particular, anything involved in the PERM process, it's actually looking at the description of the job. It's looking at what credentials are needed and normally required by the company for that particular position, not the individual's actual credentials. Okay, and so that can be one of the challenges. And so that something like that can be cleared up through a policy, but it also can be cleared up through technology, which we'll get through in just a little bit. So it sets the expectations, it sets some standards, and it clears up that kind of confusion, just preventing disappointment. I want to talk about some of the headache and the complications of the PERM process. I mentioned that we can have these basic three events that happen, but sometimes there's subcategories. And the PERM process is filled with subcategories. And PERM applies to some EB2 cases and most EB3 cases. Okay, and so this is kind of what we can consider the steps of the overall PERM process. And each of these steps, for the most part, have to happen within a certain timetable, and these steps have to be recorded. And they relate back to each other, where they all have to happen within a certain amount of time in relation to each other and in relation to the ETA 9141, the prevailing wage document submitted to the Department of Labor. And this is a document that tells us how much people in that particular industry, in that geographic area, with this particular title and description generally make based on their credentials and the requirements of the job. And this document, as well as these advertisement periods, as well as this recruitment period, as well as the filing of what some people consider the actual PERM application, the ETA 9089 application for permanent employment certification, they can all expire. And if we have a document in that process expire, then we might have to restart this whole process, or we might have to restart part of this, which we all know can be very, very expensive and very, very timely, because this is not a fast process. It can move rather slowly. And so that can definitely be a big headache, managing all of these different steps and handling this in a very efficient way. Because as we know, we're not just doing this for one person, we're doing this for a whole foreign national population. And let's go over to the next slide and talk about some pathways. Pathway management is a major, major issue, and it's a major, major problem for most employers, mid-size to large size, right? Because I understand you can't read the slide very well, and that's kind of my purpose and my point. Okay, these are your three steps with a very small foreign national population, and there's a lot of different factors here, right? We have students, we have L visas, we have a lot of different aspects here, right? Because we have different students with different needs and have different permanent solutions. And so it's not such a simple process. We're coaching our foreign national sponsored employees from the visa process all the way through their green card. And it's kind of like being a pilot, the flight attendant, the aircraft traffic controllers, the person on the ground with the little glow sticks, with the flares, directing the planes all at the same time, because you have so many different things going on. You're not just sponsoring one case, that's much more manageable. There's a lot of things going on, and that's one of the reasons why immigration is so complicated. Going to the next slide, within these pathways, we have a lot of unique factors also, right? We have somebody's current status, in addition to whatever the job opportunity is. What do job opportunities look like in the future? We have to consider their country of birth and their country of citizenship, because that affects how fast things go. Is there a visa transition needed? Are visas needed to meet immediate goals? Is someone about to fall out of status? Well, what are their long-term goals? If the long-term goal is a green card and it's going to take this person potentially 10 years to get that green card or more, thanks to delayed priority dates, are they going to be able to stay on that visa for that whole time? Well, if they're a student, F1 status or with OPT status, and it's going to take approximately 10 years or more to get a green card, probably not. Probably not. It's going to depend. Attorney's favorite answer, but probably not. So we have to consider all these different pathways and all these different factors. Going even more specifically, sometimes that job opportunity and the individuals involved can create different options where we have a plan A and we have a plan B. But sometimes things aren't exactly as they appear. Sometimes we can think, okay, this individual has Canadian citizenship, and so since they have Canadian citizenship, we're going to go down pathway A. And then later on we find, oh, actually there's a factor that we did not consider or did not incorporate. Actually, this person is a citizen of Canada. They were born in India, which puts them on a different pathway. Things like this, it's better to discuss up front. It's better to understand these things up front, so the attorney can be involved with your planning. You can plan things up front. But, sometimes they're not so obvious factors that come up. Sometimes they're factors that aren't in people's control, right? Like a change in the law, the change in regulations. And so when we are dealing with unexpected plans and unexpected factors outside of our control, it's always good to have a plan B. Even if plan A looks pretty good, it's always good to have a plan B. So we encourage you to do that also.
Hey, Allison, question from the audience. This person asks, can you sponsor someone with OPT for a green card?
You can, right? So we can go straight from OPT to a green card. I mentioned that perhaps if somebody was in a certain situation where their green card would take 10 years, that would not be possible. And that would be due to the limitations of the OPT program, right? So OPT is issued to all students who graduate from a U.S. university for a period of at least 1 year. And if somebody has a STEM degree, and the school determines whether that's a STEM degree or not, they can be eligible for an additional 24-month extension of that, so a total of 3 years. So obviously, if somebody only has that visa for, student visa with OPT for a total of 3 years, and it's going to take approximately 10 years to get a green card, right, that's not going to be possible. But short of individuals born in India and China, it is a possibility for most people. Okay, great. So we've talked about a lot of different challenges vaguely, and kind of laid out the landscape and caught people up and talked about the green card processes and some of the challenges and planning and creating an immigration policy. Now it's time to jump into the technology and talk about how technology can help address some of these challenges, how we can streamline some of these processes. And let's start with the number one question asked on a daily basis to HR professionals and managers dealing with the immigration process all over the world, and that is, what is going on with my case? Greg, I know you have an answer.
I do have an answer. This is something that we work on and we hear quite a bit here. When I was back at Yahoo, we tried to hire a software developer who is 17 years old. He was probably one of the brightest guys that I've ever met in my entire life. He said, nope, I'm going to college. And he was a foreign national at the time. He was Hungarian, actually. And after college, he ended up working for Google for a number of years. And I think he's on his 4th startup right now. The previous 3 have all sold off, so he's doing quite well for himself. But I asked him at some point, I was like, so, hey, when you came to the States, because he's now out in California, I said, hey, when you came to the States, what was that process like for you? Like, how hard was it to go through the immigration process? And, he said a lot of things that I can't necessarily repeat on a webinar. But one of the things that he said has always sort of stuck with me, which is, the great thing about going through the law firm that he went through at the time, this is a few years ago, was, I gave them all of my material, I gave them all my stuff, my passport and all of my info. And at the end of the day, a visa came out of it. I was like, well, that's great. Well, that sounds fantastic. What's wrong with that? He's like, it was so stressful because I had no idea what was going on during that entire process. And so in other words, there was no transparency for him, right? Like once that material had been handed over, it essentially went into a black box, and he had absolutely no insight into what was happening when, whether or not his case was moving forward, and so on and so forth. And so I think, what that little story illustrates is how you can use technology to really unlock that black box and shine a ray of sunshine on that and really bring transparency into that process, right? So rather than having to, shoot off emails or get on the phone and try to figure out what the heck's going on with your case or with one of your employees' cases, you don't even have to ask that question, right? You'll already know. So leveraging technology to really introduce that transparency into the immigration process, and providing real-time insights to everyone who's involved in that process, whether they're HR, whether the hiring manager, the employee, senior leadership, et cetera, that I think is one of the greatest benefits to using technology in helping manage and streamline this green card process.
And I think it also, you mentioned that, and I think, even though this is really the employer's application, the employer's in control of this application, for jobs that attract type A personalities like myself that want to be in control of the situation, even when I'm not even directly in control, I think it probably adds a lot of security also, knowing exactly what's going on.
Exactly, and you see that with every foreign national that we interact with, right? Immigration, for an HR professional, it's obviously a hugely important part of your job, if not your complete job, right? But for foreign national, it's, I always say here internally when we're talking to, for example, when we are talking to job candidates and we're talking about our mission, it's, if you're working for another company, if you don't get your Uber, you don't get an Uber ride, right? If you're a foreign national who doesn't get their visa, you're either not staying in the country or you're not coming into the country. So in other words, it's so critically important to those foreign nationals going through this experience. So the more you can use technology to help them understand where they are in that process, how that process is moving forward, and even just as importantly, if there's hiccups in that process or problems in that process, really bring that level of transparency into this whole immigration sort of journey really does a lot in terms of being able to help reduce some of the anxiety and reduce some of the stress associated with it.
And Greg helped to actually create some aspects of technology that are used to help the audience on this call today, people who are actually implementing and upholding some of these policies that employers have. Can we talk a little bit about that, how we can use technology in conjunction with a company's immigration policy to kind of streamline some of these aspects?
Sure, so absolutely. So, they sort of say that the best developer is somebody who's incredibly lazy, right? They don't want to have to do the same thing over and over again, and you don't want to have to think about how you're going to go ahead and do something that becomes repetitive, right? And I think in some ways the same thing can sort of be applied to an immigration policy in the sense of it's certainly not, like Allison mentioned at the outset of the webinar, it's certainly not a set it and forget it thing. It's something that you're obviously going to want to revisit over time and as your situation changes and so on and so forth. But it does take it does reduce sort of the stress and the mental energy that you would have to otherwise expend in terms of thinking, right, for employee A, how are we going to handle their green card versus employee B, how should we handle their green card, right? It really reduces it down and says, we have a process in place so that we can make sure that we're treating both employee A and B fairly, transparently, and so that everyone knows where they stand in that process. I think one of the things that we're also seeing that we also sort of mentioned a little bit at the outset is that increasingly, companies are starting to think of having an immigration policy as a, very much as a talent acquisition tool, right? Going out and saying, all right, it's one of the questions that we're starting to get as we interview developers. We see people saying, well, what's your immigration policy, right? Will you help me sponsor me on my green card? And so as these labor markets heat up and as things become more and more competitive, having that immigration policy in place and having that immigration policy in place in such a way that it's very easy to adjust it using some sort of software tool or something like that can go a long way in terms of making you more competitive in this labor market.
Can you show us how Envoy has implemented some of that with the perm process? And here, we're going to give you some examples of how Envoy is doing this. There's lots of different ways, there's lots of different systems, and there's even things that you can do on your own that can be helpful with this. But, advertisements is definitely something that's always a challenge. Can you show us a little bit what you did here?
Well, I think stepping back from that, before we actually jump into the recruitment side of things, as long as you stay on the actual immigration policy, I think one of the things that we do is that we allow you to actually set up a policy within the platform. And the advantages of that are, once an employee hits a certain threshold or meets whatever the requirements are in terms of how you've set up that policy within the Envoy platform, then it's sort of off to the races, right? You don't have to think about, oh my goodness, do I need to open up a green card case for Samir, or is it automatically going to kind of move through that process? Am I going to be alerted to that fact? So I think, and there's on the one hand, it's like, how do we enable our employees? How do we support them? How do we help them move through that immigration process and kick that off? And then I think what Allison's now sort of more referring to is, on the flip side, how do you use technology to make sure that the way you're going through that immigration process is compliant, is as simple as possible, because as Allison mentioned, this is incredibly messy, and it's incredibly complicated. How do we use technology to kind of move through that? Is that what you were kind of getting at?
It's a balancing act, yeah, absolutely. Let's get some specific situations here. Thanks.
Sure. So moving on to, I think we're already on this other slide around the common challenges, right? As Allison mentioned, a few minutes ago, there's sort of really two major components to managing this recruitment process, managing this perm recruitment process. On the one hand, you have the advertisements, and on the other hand, you really have the applicant review portion. And maybe Allison can spend a couple minutes actually talking in a little bit more detail about some of the pitfalls around that advertisement piece.
Sure. And I think, when we're talking about applicants, we're talking about, in the perm process, we actually have to advertise the position to U.S. workers before we can go forward with sponsoring that foreign national. And so when we're referring to applicants here, we're talking about the U.S. workers applying for that particular job to see if they meet the minimum requirements for that position. And so, some of the issues with advertisements is that the government, the Department of Labor and USCIS tells us that we have to advertise in a certain way. They don't want us just automatically sponsoring a foreign national, right? Because we don't want to discriminate against the U.S. workers. If we have available U.S. worker, then we should be hiring that available U.S. worker. We're hiring foreign talent because we can't find those people, and there's a talent shortage. And so, this recruitment period, what we have to do is there are certain mandatory recruitment steps, such as advertising in Sunday newspapers, such as dealing with the state workforce agency and posting notices that a job is available. But there's also additional recruitment steps, right? So there's things like there's a list of different items, and employers get to pick which one they want. So, for example, advertising at a job fair is one of those things, or advertising on the radio is another, having it posted on your website. So there's different factors there, and a little bit of flexibility there, but ultimately this process is not actually flexible at all. It's solid, it's rock solid, and the period of how long these different pieces must be advertised are set in stone. So we have certain day requirements on that. And like I said, they relate back to each other, so all the things have to happen within a certain time frame. So you have a lot of messy pieces.
But they also vary based on the type of advertisement you're running, right?
Correct.
And the
right, they're not all the same.
The consequences if you don't meet up with whatever those regulations are become really, really important, right?
Absolutely.
So for example, like one of the things is the internal posting notice, which I believe has to run for 10 business days, right? So if there's a holiday that falls in there, that doesn't count as part of that. And so there's ways of using technology to make sure that you're tracking all of those dates appropriately, and to make sure that all that information is accurately captured within a system, right? So to make sure that you are in compliance. And the same thing when we're talking about people coming and applying for a given job, right? It's very important, and Allison can speak to this a little bit more, in depth from a legal perspective, but it's been very important to make sure that, you're following exactly the letter of the law in terms of how you review each applicant, and to make sure that you're capturing all that information around every applicant that comes through your system in such a way that you're to make sure that you're compliant, right? If we jump over to the next slide, at the same time on sort of on the back end in terms of how like a legal services provider, how a law firm might handle that, right? There are certain dates that once you hit those dates, you become eligible to file the next stage in the green card process, the ETA 9089. And as Allison mentioned a few minutes ago as well, like you have to do all of this entire perm process within a certain time frame, right? So if you miss those dates and you're out outside of what's called the last possible filing date, then you may have to restart that entire recruitment process all over again, and that becomes a very not only expensive proposition in terms of having to rerun all those ads and things like that, but it also becomes problematic from an employee retention and talent acquisition standpoint, right? The recruitment process as a whole can take quite a bit of time, and God forbid you have to restart it and go through that whole jump through all those hoops all over again.
And I bet most of the people on the call today know these things are going on, but I get that most of the time your attorney's tracking this for you as they should be, just because it's a very complicated process. But I think one of the frustrations when I speak to HR professionals as well as foreign national employees, the foreign national employees are not a part of this process. They can't be involved, right, because we're actually recruiting for the job they have or want. So they just remain frustrated, and we can't give them much insight to that. But for you all, these things are happening. You might have been involved in planning the initial strategy of how these types of advertisements are going to be carried out, and then they're just, you're told to do certain things. You do the things you're told to do, and you don't see anything else in. Every place, for the most part, that I've worked for prior to coming to Envoy, we had technology, we used technology, but for whatever reason, the vast majority of attorneys that I know, we just track this on a piece of paper. There's a piece of paper stapled onto the cover of a file. There's a chart that looks something like this, and this is how things are being tracked. And so there is a lot of room for error. Not suggesting that any attorneys that you're working with would make such an error, because attorneys have their systems that work for them. But the thing is about this is it's nice because it gives you some insight into the process. Human error happens. No one's perfect. It allows you to see what's going on. It allows you to remain in control of that process, and another set of eyes watching the whole process.
And at the same time, it hopefully provides some additional safeguards so we can catch some of those errors that we know do happen, and really prevent them from happening.
And speaking of errors, we're talking a little bit about how technology can reduce the possibility of interruptions in work. Obviously, an error in the perm process could completely derail one of those pathways that we were planning. Technology can go and control and watch and monitor lots of critical important dates, visa stamps, I-94s, approval notices, expiration dates, passports. There's a tremendous amount of organization, skill, and energy that you're putting in on a daily basis. We recognize that. And there's a lot of things that have to be monitored even above and beyond the just general perm process, just your daily basis of all your large foreign national populations. Generally speaking, most people have a calendar, and sometimes they're even using tickler systems through their email or their Outlook, where they're getting an email sent to themselves. But even with that, again, if you leave, if you go on vacation, if you're the only one in control of this, what happens while you're gone? And I'm sure a lot of you have faced that previously. What happens when I'm gone if I'm the only one who does this? If there's two of you who are doing this, what happens if you're both out of the office at a conference or some type of event? What happens then, right? And I'm sure that different companies deal with that in different ways, but oftentimes if someone leaves a particular position, there isn't necessarily another plan. So, using technology can provide a reliable place for all parties to go to in order to understand what's going on and help synchronize the processes in some of these states. We understand that tech can also speed up the assembly process when there's a case, but some of the challenges can involve a lack of ownership in timely case processing. And what do I mean by untimely case processing? Well, we can look at this in two different ways. One is we can watch and we can monitor and we can keep track by looking at how long it takes to assemble a case, right? Is my employee getting in the information that they need to so the lawyer can do their job? Is the lawyer taking the time that they're supposed to according to our SLAs? Or we can look at this as, okay, fine, after a case is sent over to the government, let's be honest, it's not on most people's top of mind after that. After it's been submitted, we're just waiting. But who's monitoring and who's watching to make sure that if that case goes beyond the normal government processing times, it's being checked up on. And oftentimes, we find that it's the foreign national employee asking, what's going on with my case, the number one question, before it's actually recognized that case has gone beyond normal processing times. So, in watching all that, we understand the issues like HR turnover can be a problem. We understand that case processing can be a problem, and this really can solve some of those basic challenges. Moving on to our next slide.
So it looks like we have a few questions that are coming in. We want to make sure that we have sufficient time to get to those.
Okay, all right.
So we have a question regarding monitoring priority dates. When we're talking about monitoring priority dates, are you talking about the movement of the month visa bulletin issued by the Department of State? Watching how long it's going to take certain people to become permanent residents and get their green card?
Yes, okay, so we are talking about the monthly visa bulletin and watching how those priority dates are impacting the ability of people to file the last part of their green card process, adjustment of status if they're currently inside the United States, or consular processing if they're outside the United States. But this type of data and this type of information can also be used to make predictions. So, right, the technology can actually monitor these types of cases over time and actually, provide the data needed so immigration attorneys can make better recommendations on EB3 versus EB2 categories. And so that point can be done in two different ways. I also just want to mention here with this slide, even though we're short on time, we'll go through this quickly. I think we already answered kind of the challenge of perm headaches and how technology can improve that. But in regards to employee planning and family immigration planning, we're talking about technology can help people by, I guess, involving their process in this journey and letting them know they're not alone. There are certainly important dates for families that come into the immigration process and come into play. For example, if there's a child who's a teenager, there are certain things that can and can't happen at age 18 if they're a derivative of your primary employee. At age 21, if they're a derivative, they're going to lose that status as soon as they hit that 21st birthday. And what's the plan for that individual, right? For those individuals, we might need to hurry along the green card process. And, by using technology that helps track those family dates, that can be considered a significant perk for a family because they know that someone's watching out and caring for their children. And that's a really important thing too. But let's go on to those questions because we are at the end of our hour here.
So one question that came across that I think is really interesting is around the fact that the DOLs, there's been an increase in investigations and perm audits.
Yes.
That attorneys are reporting that often the audit is questioning whether a particular application or a particular petition is due to business necessity or whether the employer's requirements for the sponsor position are, quote, normal or normally required in the occupation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, one of the ways that this can be really helpful is that, information from past successful cases can be captured and referred back to. So, for example, if an employer needs to demonstrate that the requirements for the job is normal, They can look at their own cases. It'd be really difficult to remember that 2 years ago, we had a couple of these types of cases, the exact same requirements go through, and they were successful. It'd be, maybe there's super talented people out there, but remembering the name and the job title and the description, everything from a couple of years back can be really difficult. So it would be pretty nice to just be able to go back and remember that this has already happened before, and the Department of Labor has already qualified these jobs as normal.
I mean, I think there's another thing that you could add to that, which is around, like, how do you use, if we're talking about, since the subject of the webinar is technology, like how we can use technology to help capture everything that goes on throughout a case, and sort of aggregate all that information up into compliance reports too, right? So rather than, I know from talking to some other folks that is very often, a lot of times, a lot of this information is literally stuffed in a filing drawer somewhere, right? And sometimes, I go a little wild at home cleaning out my filing drawers, like, and hopefully that stuff doesn't get lost, but it obviously can get lost sometimes, right? And so rather than having that offline on paper, having the ability to collate all this information together and aggregate it into a report online can be hugely valuable when it comes to, when it comes to an audit or something like that.
Absolutely, that's great, especially if you're ever in the place of supervised recruitment where the government is actually monitoring all of your steps in a particular perm case. You can provide evidence like, listen, we've been following the law, we've been following the rules, we have the data, we have the information, I can prove it to you. Whether you'd want to open up something like that to a government officer, that's going to depend on a case-by-case basis, and you're going to want to rely on your attorney before you go above and beyond sharing information that is not specifically requested. But depending on the circumstances and depending on the potential investigation, the subject of it, or if there's any charges pending against you, that could save you tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds, having that history in those reports. A couple of best practices here, just kind of in summary: use technology, create a policy, work smarter, not harder, designate multiple resources familiar with keeping immigration journeys on track. Consistency and standardization is key. Immigration perks and employee goals, you want to remember those throughout your immigration process and making your plans. Also have a plan B, because we always want a plan B, and sometimes we even want a plan C if that's available, and that can always be done from the very beginning of a staff.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Greg and Allison, for the great presentation today. We have just a couple of minutes for some questions, so I'll try to ask both of you a question here and there. One of our audience members wants to know, how many people do you think should manage a company's immigration program?
I think that really depends significantly by a couple different factors. Number one, how big is your immigration program? Okay, if you just have a handful of people, you probably don't need more than one person, and that person's probably not going to be doing this full time. But the larger your foreign national population grows, the more people you're going to want to put that. But also there's an aspect of the technology, right? You're always going to need people involved. We're never going to be able to rely fully on technology because we don't want to, because there's a lot of different dynamic factors, and we don't necessarily want the programs making legal decisions for us, of course, right? But it can help us where we can dedicate certain resources that won't need to put all that mental time and energy into managing their case processes, right? Ideally, if you have these types of policies, you're using technology. If employees and managers have access to that technology, you're going to get less questions. So I think, if you have some specific questions about your organization, feel free to reach out to us at envoyglobal.com, and there's resources there where you can give us a call or you can chat with us through our website. You can talk to me specifically, Allison Kranz. I'd be happy to discuss that with you, and we can set up an appointment to chat. But lots of factors to consider there also, and maybe we can point you in the right direction.
Great. Next question. How long does it take to process a green card using this technology versus not using any? Greg, do you want to?
Well, I think that's a very broad question, because again, it depends. that's my favorite answer to everything.
That's a typical lawyer answer.
There you go. It depends, okay? Because I think what happens here is that by using this technology, it can speed up the front end of the process. It can speed up increase the efficiencies of you, the employee, the attorney involved. But then we got to turn over to the government, right? And that technology is not necessarily going to impact the government processing time other than by monitoring the case and letting us know when it's outside normal processing time.
But I think far more importantly than how it can speed up the process is really how it can really help make sure that you remain in compliance with whatever the government regulations are, right? And when you're leveraging technology, hopefully that's been informed and really sort of guided throughout this entire process. Making sure that everything is captured in such a way that you are really compliant, and so that, when the government does come knocking at your door and say, hey, we need to see, X, Y, and Z, that you really do have a full record of all the steps that you took and every action that was taken, say, with respect to, an applicant or to the advertisement. So it's not just really about speeding up the process, it's really about speeding it up and making sure you're compliant at the same time.
All right,
Great
good point.
answers. All right, well, that just about wraps things up. Alice and Greg, thank you once again for joining us on today's presentation. Anyone on the line, a recording will be distributed, and it will also be uploaded to Envoy Global's Resource Center, where you can download it along with the slide deck. If you have any additional questions, please head to envoyglobal.com, where you can send us an email or give us a call. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.